The Chicago Bears roster still has plenty of holes, but some of their recent free agent signings have given them at least some flexibility to where they don't have to draft a specific position with their early picks later this week.
You are Locked On Bears, your daily Chicago Bears podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
This is Locked On Bears, and I'm your host, Lorin Cox. I'm here to bring you your daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. You can follow me on Twitter at CoxSports1. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Locked On Bears. You can like Locked On Bears on Facebook. Join the Locked On Bears Facebook group for even more Bears talk. And make sure you hit that subscribe button on the Locked On Bears YouTube channel to keep up with all of our video podcasts as well. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. On the show today, we're going through some of the recent additions the Bears have made. They all they don't fly fully under the radar this time of year, but they're not the headline type making free agent acquisitions. But it did give you a couple players with some upside at some pretty big positions of need. Not that it solves those needs completely, but it does feel like, okay, they've got a little bit more of a baseline established at a few of those spots to feel like you don't have to use, say, your first pick in this draft on those positions of need specifically. Like, you're not totally screwed if you wait a little bit in this draft, because you do still have options on the roster and outside of the draft as well to still address some of the holes remaining on this Bears team. I think the free agent to be most excited about is at wide receiver, David Moore, who they signed most recently. Well, he bounced around with a few different teams last season, so I guess most recently actually with the Green Bay Packers, but known for starting his career with the Seattle Seahawks. In a 6 foot, 215 pound, he was a Division II player, 7th round pick for them a handful of years ago now, and kind of surprised and grew into a bigger role there. I mean, eventually mostly like the number 3, number 4 wide receiver, but had a couple of seasons there of 400 plus yards. I think it was 3 years in a row of like 400-ish, 300-ish, and then 400-ish, and kind of settled into a nice spot there. Like, second year as a 7th round pick, he became that true like number 3 receiver because of injuries on their roster, and he was a pretty good vertical downfield receiver for them. He and Russell Wilson were able to connect on some deep balls there and make a decent connection. He's got some speed. He's got some explosiveness. He's not the fastest or the most explosive, but he moves pretty well at 6 foot 215. Fairly strong there. Not a guy that drops a lot of passes, although it did seem like going through his time in Seattle, he wasn't the best on like contested catches, where if somebody's going to make some real contact with him, he wasn't like a strong catcher in that regard. But I did think he wasn't just purely a deep ball guy. He had some ability to win underneath as well. Like, he really held down that, like, call it number 3, number 4 type rotational wide receiver role in 2019 and 2020, and then he wasn't really like taking that next step for them, and ultimately kind of left in free agency. Signed with the Panthers last year on a multi-year deal, but they cut him before week 1. And that's kind of where the red flag is here, right? And that's where this is why he's available for the Bears at this stage and this cheaply, and to come in at this sort of role for Chicago, that you're not necessarily sure that you're getting the 400-yard receiver in the Seahawks offense. I mean, this season he was on the practice squad, I think, with Denver for a little while, and then Green Bay with Bears offensive coordinator Luke Getsy. So there's some advanced familiarity there, although very limited, I would suggest, off the top. But it's like there's certainly a player that's not to his prime yet, or maybe just entering his prime physically, a player with some impressive production, relatively speaking, to where he was drafted, where he went to school, and the role he was in Seattle. He was able to carve out some opportunities for himself. And kind of given what the Bears have at wide receiver right now, there's some opportunity for him to carve out some roles for himself, especially after Byron Pringle's arrest. That probably won't prove to be all that consequential to Pringle's season. Still, there's an opportunity here in Chicago. And I think, well, David Moore is not so good that I'm like not going to draft a wide receiver in the second round if they're there. I do feel like he gives me at least something to where if I don't get, say, a bona fide playmaking wide receiver with those 2 second-round picks. For whatever reason, you want to go other positions of need or other positions of strength in this draft class. Between Mooney, Pringle, St. Brown, and David Moore, you at least have like 4 NFL caliber wide receivers. They're all, it's Mooney and then a bunch of guys that are 3s and 4s, but at least it's like, it's 4 guys down now to where I still want to add more at wide receiver. The team still needs to add more at wide receiver. Like I said, David Moore doesn't keep me from adding there, but I do feel like a little bit better about saying like, I don't have to take one in the second round. I can get away with it if for whatever reason the draft doesn't fall that way. I'm not so desperate at wide receiver that I have to reach and take whatever potential second round wide receiver I could possibly get, because you feel like maybe Pringle could be something, and maybe Moore could be a little bit more, and maybe Equinemius St. Brown, right? It's another one of these, one of those guys with potential where it's like he's off his rookie deal at this point, had some disappointments at times in his career, and is looking for that bounce back role. And Moore really fits that same mold as a lot of these other receivers that Ryan Poles has brought in this offseason. And so it helps ease the burden of, maybe you wait till the third round to get a wide receiver, you add another player in this mix, and you have a big competition and a big rotation. Again, you would like to do more, you'd like to add more, there still should be other opportunities to add more, but for now, you have M-O-O-R-E, more, on the roster there. Pun very much intended there. So David Moore's, he's a guy to be, excited about is a strong word. We don't want to overhype a guy that might not make the 53-man roster, right? When you sign at this stage, you're not really guaranteed much of anything, but there is some real potential there. And another one of these potential value signings that could end up playing a bigger role or could end up being very little, but it's that low risk, high reward, or at least decent reward possibility there from a guy like David Moore that opens things up at least a little bit more in the draft. You can still take 2 wide receivers in the second round, like we talked about on yesterday's podcast with Brian Perez from the Draft Network. David Moore's not precluding me from double dipping at that position, but I don't feel as driven and compelled to say this is a need I have to fill with that second round pick. Still need to fill it in some combination of ways, but just doesn't have to be right away, and it opens the possibilities up just a little bit more. I think some of the moves the Bears have made in the secondary have gotten them closer to this sort of area too. Doesn't eliminate the need, but kind of opens up what the Bears could do and where they could ultimately add in the secondary. We'll kind of go through the recent cornerbacks the Bears have brought in. One particularly impressive. The other has some real potential still too that hasn't really been tapped into as of late. Next on Locked On Bears. Today's episode of Locked On Bears is brought to you by our friends at Athletic Greens. They're the makers of AG1. It's a product that I use literally every single day. You mix a scoop of it in with water, and it's like your superfood vitamin supplement. I usually do it at the beginning of my day to start my day off right, particularly on an empty stomach. It really kind of lines the lining of your stomach and helps you absorb it a little bit faster, and then kind of starts you off with everything you need. 75 high-quality vitamins, minerals, whole food sourced superfoods, probiotics, and adaptogens to really get things rolling. It's a special blend of ingredients that supports your gut health, your nervous system, your immune system, your energy, your recovery, your focus, your aging. AG1 has it all. And it tastes pretty good too. You scoop it when 8 ounces of water, you shake it up, you drink it with your breakfast, and boom, you are on the go. It's lifestyle friendly, whether you eat keto or paleo or vegan or dairy-free or gluten-free. It's got less than a gram of sugar, no GMOs, and none of those extra like chemicals or artificial anything, while still tasting good. All the support you need, and it's there. It's like a better vitamin. To make it easy, Athletic Greens is going to give away a free year supply of immune-supporting vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. All you have to do is visit athleticgreens.com/NFL Network. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/NFL Network to take ownership over your health and pick up the ultimate daily nutritional insurance. Well, we're just a few days away from the NFL draft, and our friends at BetOnline.net are going to be your source for all of your NFL draft betting needs. They've got all the possible bets you can think of. They can slice and dice the draft in so many different ways, and it makes it that much more fun if you've been following the draft coverage closely and want to use some of your knowledge on those first-round prop bets on how many offensive and defensive players will go in the first round, how many players at each position are going to go in the first round. You know, what who's going to be the first cornerback, the first offensive lineman, the first quarterback selected, and so much more. Our friends at BetOnline are the number one place we recommend for all of your sports betting needs, including live betting, playoffs in all the other sports, esports, and more. Head on over to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about the trends and action you need to know. BetOnline, where the game starts. The Bears haven't done a lot with their secondary through free agency. It's been a lot of the same type of guys, but they brought in a couple cornerbacks in recent weeks and just over the weekend too. The next one came in, and all of a sudden, it's not a solved position. It's not perfect. It's not exactly what you would want, but there's some names there now where it's like, okay, when you start to look through Bears mock drafts and stuff or do them yourself, you're not seeing as frequently cornerback being that position with those second-round picks. It's in there. You'll definitely see it sometimes, and there's a very good chance that a cornerback or even a safety is the Bears' best player available at one of those two second-round picks, and they pull the trigger there. But a lot of it tends to be obviously wide receiver, like we talked about, in offensive line, like we will talk about here in just a little bit. But first, more recently, they just signed Greg Stroman, a free agent cornerback. He had been with the Washington football team for most of his career. He was on some practice squads this past season with a couple of different teams bouncing around. But Stroman's a real interesting guy because he was a 7th-round pick for them in 2018 out of Virginia Tech. 6 foot, 180 pounds, really, really good punt returner in college. Didn't test super, super well at the combine. And pretty good, 3-cone, but not particularly, explosive in the jumps. And his 40 wasn't anything to particularly write home about. And actually, he really hasn't done much punt returning in the NFL, which is surprising because he had 4, 5, 6 touchdowns on punt returns in college. But regardless, when he was a rookie as a 7th-round pick, the Washington football team had some injuries that forced him into the starting lineup as a rookie. I think he started the first couple of games of his career on the outside and then moved into the slot later in that season for the same kind of situation. I think they had some other rookies with a slot cornerback, and he really finished playing well. For a 7th-round pick, he looked pretty darn good as a rookie cornerback, playing both the outside and the inside in his first year. It was particularly impressive, and I know a lot of people in Washington were high on his potential. Now, that was 4 years ago, because then 2019, he's on injured reserve, hurt all season. 2020, he plays a couple of games and then has a foot injury and misses all of that season on injured reserve. So then heading into 2021, I think they cut him during training camp or in the lead up to week 1 and bounced around on some practice squads. So we haven't really seen high levels of play from Greg Stroman in 3 years. As a rookie, he was kind of like that Thomas Graham, right, for the Bears, where it's comes in as a rookie and it's wow, you're really impressed and you want to see more and you can't wait to see more. It's just he's been hurt for 2 seasons, and then for whatever reason, after 2 straight seasons of missing time, you might imagine it can be hard to come back and pick up exactly where you left off. So didn't really get much of an opportunity and just was the practice squad guy last season. So you could see where maybe he comes to Chicago and is a training camp cut and whatever. No harm, no foul there. But you can also see where you like that guy that you saw as a rookie 4 years ago or 3 or 4 years ago now, and the injuries aren't his fault. And if he's had a fully healthy 2021 season because he barely played, does he come into this season a little bit more durable or a little bit more ready to last and at least compete and show what you can do? I mean, at worst, you add him into the competition where you already have Kindle Vildor and Thomas Graham and kind of say, okay, one of you is going to be the starter on the outside and see if one of these young players with potential can take that step forward as of right now. And then, loser can get cut or go on the practice squad or whatever it might be. But I think Stroman definitely is inserted in the possibility here of there's some upside you're swinging for, and maybe you find something, maybe you move on and it doesn't really cost you anything. Right? I think especially when you've been able to secure the slot with a free agent like Tavon Young, who they signed earlier this month, then you can really feel like you can hone in on that outside cornerback spot for Greg Stroman, and all of a sudden the competition isn't as critical when you're not also trying to compete in the slot. Right? For a little bit there, we were wondering is it going to be Duke Shelley in the slot and Kindle Vildor and Thomas Graham on the outside? But then if Graham loses, would he compete in the slot? And would 2 of those 3 guys be 2 of your starters there? But Tavon Young comes over from Baltimore as clearly the Bears signed him and he should be your starting slot cornerback. He's 5'9", 195 pounds, 28 years old. He was the Ravens starting slot cornerback last year. Has been their starter for multiple seasons here and had some really good seasons. I mean, he was their 4th round pick in 2016. Actually, despite being 5'9" in his rookie season, He actually started games as an outside cornerback, despite being very undersized, even as a rookie. Then they bumped him inside to the slot there later on in the season as I think some injury situations changed. And much like Greg Stroman, really strong rookie season. A lot to be encouraged about by Tavon Young. And so then goes into year 2, tears his ACL. Well, then, year 3, he gets the starting spot back in the slot again, plays pretty darn well, and then gets a big contract extension from the Ravens that offseason. It was like 3 years, $26 million. 2019 has a neck injury, pretty much misses the whole season, or does miss the whole season. 2020 comes back, all right, starts the first couple games, tears his ACL again in 2020, like 2 games into that season. So back-to-back years missed with injured reserve. This past season, 2021, he was back as the starter, pretty much played the whole year for Baltimore and played, again, pretty well. So again, it's like if Tavon Young is healthy and stays healthy and doesn't have one of these like sort of freak season-ending injuries, but again, fool me once, shame on me, fool me 3 times, you question how reliably durable Tavon Young is going to be. But if he's healthy, I mean, you're set. Like they made him the highest paid slot cornerback at one point in his career. Like that's how much they liked Tavon Young in Baltimore. And that's the type of player the Bears are hoping they get with this free agent signing. And it puts them in the position to where you don't have to draft a slot cornerback, certainly. You don't, between him and Greg Stroman, and then you have Thomas Graham and Kindle Vildor, you want to do better at outside cornerback. That group of outside cornerbacks was not good enough last season. But I don't feel like I have to get a cornerback with that 39th overall pick, right? I mean, you want to, you really do, but you don't have to. You can wait a little bit in this draft, potentially still get a decent player to compete in that rotation. And of course, as we'll get into in a little bit, there's still other ways for the Bears to add more players at some of these positions of need. Particularly, I think the offensive line is going to be an important one there. They did just sign Julian Davenport, formerly of the Houston Texans, and a few other teams, and we'll kind of break down where he fits in this offensive tackle situation and what that means for the Bears' draft plans and beyond the draft next on Locked On Bears. The fun part about the NFL draft is all the different moving parts to keep in track of, and nobody knows more about moving parts than our friends at RockAutocom. They're a family business that have been serving auto parts customers online for over 20 years. They get everything you could possibly need for your vehicle, from engine control modules and fuel pump assemblies to easy stuff like tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpeting. I mean, you name it, they have it at RockAuto.com. It's an amazing catalog, but it's super easy to navigate. You just enter in your car's make and model, and then boom, it pulls up all the different parts for your vehicle, and you can sort between the brands, specifications, and prices you prefer. Those prices are particularly important because some of the chain part stores will have a different price tier for professional mechanics and do-it-yourselfers like us, but RockAuto.com's prices are the same for everybody, so don't spend up to twice as much for the same parts somewhere else. Head on over to RockAuto.com and see all the parts available for your car or truck. When you check out, write the words "Locked On" in their "How did you hear about us" box so they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. RockAuto.com. The Chicago Bears certainly need more quality offensive linemen, and they tried to add to the mix here by signing Julian Davenport. He'd kind of been bouncing around a little bit. Had spent last season with the Colts and Matt Eberflus, albeit on the other side of the ball. So there's a little bit of a familiarity there, but I guess I'm a little bit surprised that familiarity didn't preclude them from signing Julian Davenport, because he's really been pretty bad throughout his NFL career. And this is kind of the spot where, I don't feel like this free agent signing has necessarily, calmed any concerns about the offensive line. It is certainly depth with experience, but it's not what I would consider quality experience. So Julian Davenport was a 4th-round pick out of FCS school, Bucknell, in 2018, I think. And 6'7", 315 pounds, 27-year-old now, and he doesn't really fit that type of mold that Ryan Poles has talked about for the new offensive line, right? Remember he said they wanted to be a little bit lighter and faster, and Davenport's fairly big and heavy and ran a really slow 40-yard dash at the combine. He had a fast 3-cone, so maybe the short area quickness is a little bit faster, a little bit more like fluid, but not like fast and agile in quite that same way. It's just not, it doesn't quite seem to fit that way. But like throughout his career, he's been a starter multiple times for multiple teams. For the Texans, he was their left tackle starter in 2018, played like the whole year for them, but he had 16 penalties that season, which I think was the most among offensive linemen. He was tied for the first most pressures allowed by any offensive tackles, and second most sacks allowed by any offensive tackle that season. So yes, bad season, but it's the start of his career. Okay, right, well, gets traded to the Dolphins in the Tunzel deal, and he started week 1 for them at left tackle and then got hurt and he had a knee injury. He came back for like the final 7 games of that 2019 season for Miami as their starting tackle. Over that final 7 weeks of 2019, he allowed the second most pressures of any offensive tackle and the third most sacks. So he's had like multiple seasons as one of the worst starting offensive tackles in the NFL. Then he was a backup for them in 2020. 2021, he signs with the Colts. They put him in for Eric Fisher. Their left tackle was hurt, so Davenport started week 1 there. Then Fisher was back, but their right tackle, Braden Smith, was hurt, so they put Davenport in at right tackle for another like 4 or 5 games. As soon as both of those guys were healthy, they threw him on the bench. Colts fans thought he was terrible, really didn't see why he kept being on the field, and they wanted to see him benched much, much earlier. So it just seems to me like he's kind of the offensive tackle version of Dakota Dozier, who the Bears signed earlier this offseason from the Minnesota Vikings. Another one of these guys who has some seasons of starting experience where he was considerably one of the worst starting guards in the NFL, and Vikings fans constantly wanted him replaced, constantly wanted him benched, and were scratching their head as to why the Bears even bothered signing him. And Davenport's sort of in that same mix to where ideally, you should have 3 better offensive tackles than him. If you have enough depth, then you shouldn't have him on your roster. And if he's part of your roster and heaven forbid your starting lineup, then that would generally mean you're in some real trouble on the offensive line. So that could lead you to say, well, okay, got to get an offensive lineman in the second round. And like, honestly, probably like one of those first 3 picks needs to be an offensive lineman somewhere in there. Maybe it can be the 3rd round, but when you don't pick again until the 5th, I want one of those first 3 offensive picks, or one of those first 3 picks to be an offensive lineman, because it's just such a big need for this team right now. They don't really have a real starting right guard, and there's not a lot of depth anywhere on the offensive line. They're going to need more. But I still think there's some flexibility here, not because of the guys they have on the roster now, but because it seems to me like the plan for Ryan Poles is to still really hit that post-draft free agent market. And I'm not talking about college undrafted free agents, but like other free agents available that you can go in the draft and see what you get. If you get an offensive lineman, great. You don't have to sign one later. You get wide receivers, great. You don't have to sign one later. You get cornerbacks, great. Don't have to sign one later. But you don't have to go into the draft saying, I have to get my starting right guard right away with that first, second round pick, because you can look at the free agent market, and not that it's a great group, but there's still potential starting caliber players out there. Like Trey Turner from Steelers is kind of the one that we've heard a lot about potentially this offseason, but J.C. Tretter from the Browns, Eric Flowers from Washington. I mean, you've got Alex Lewis from the Jets, Billy Price from the Giants, although he's been kind of mediocre at points in his career. I mean, there's a few different guys. Laurent Duvernay-Tardif. There's offensive guards. There's offensive tackles too, actually, if you go down the list of free agent offensive linemen. There's still veterans that are better than Julian Davenport that you could call borderline starting caliber players, but certainly upgrades over what the Chicago Bears have. Same thing's true at wide receiver, right? I mean, you got guys out there still like, I mean, the Bears probably aren't going to be in on Jarvis Landry or Odell Beckham, but they're both out there. You got Will Fuller, T.Y. Hilton, Emmanuel Sanders, Alan Hearns, Danny Amendola, Adam Humphries, Mohamed Sanu, D.D. Westbrook. And I mean, none of those are guys, well, except for the first couple, are not number 1 receivers, but probably better than who the Bears have signed at those positions so far. There's still options out there. But if you get a great wide receiver in this draft, you don't have to sign one. If you miss out on the wide receivers, you can still get somebody in the post-draft free agent market that gives you that flexibility. Same kind of thing at cornerback, right? Joe Hayden, Trey Waynes, Kyle Fuller, and a familiar face there. Jason Verrett, Kevin King, Xavier Rhodes is a name I keep thinking the Bears are probably going to sign at some point, given the Colts' familiarity with Eberflus, but still hasn't happened yet. Tashawn Gibson still sitting out there at safety if you don't get a safety you like in this draft. So there's no need to really press and really feel like you have to hit the exact needs with those exact picks. No reason to reach. You want to upgrade those needs positions if you absolutely can. Please do. Double dip if you have to, wherever the board's going to take you. But there are free agent options available, and there are guys already on the roster that at least give you some kind of mix of something that you feel like you can assemble a somewhat competitive team with at least holes filled by guys that you have some reason to believe there could be some upside still to be met there. We'll see what the draft has in store for us here. The days are winding down here. We're breaking it all down for you right here on the Locked On Bears podcast. So make sure you hit that subscribe button to keep up with all of our daily, in-depth Chicago Bears news and analysis. Just so you know, the Locked On Podcast Network is hosting live coverage of the 2022 NFL Draft from our TV studios in Dallas with pick-by-pick analysis from our local team experts, including myself and our NFL Draft gurus. So tune in all 3 days as our draft team guides you through every pick and every trade in real time. It all starts on Thursday at 6 o'clock Central Time, available on the Locked On NFL on YouTube and on the Odyssey app. Our draft preparation isn't done yet. We'll have more of that coming for you this week. Thanks for making Locked On Bears your first listen today. I hope as a result, it's just a little bit easier for you to bear down.